Good afternoon, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. We've got a very special 2 hours ahead talking about the situation in Iran at all levels. What is going on there, what the government is doing, what the people of Iran are doing and want. How close is Iran to developing a nuclear weapon? Are they even trying to develop a nuclear weapon? What can they do with high enriched uranium? And what should the role of United States policymakers be to respond? We are getting our first guest on the line is going to be Alex Vatanka. I think we're calling him right now. He's on the line. Terrific.
Hi there, Mark.
Oh, he's great. All right, great. Glad to have you with us. Mr. Vatanka has a specialty in Middle Eastern affairs. He's with the Middle Eastern Institute and was the managing editor of Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst. Now, if you know Jane's, you know that they are sort of the gold standard of looking at around the globe at weapons and systems and finding out what's going on around the globe. So you are certainly an expert in this. I'd like to ask you to start, before we get to Iran's nuclear program and what anyone should do about it, I want to start with some basics here so that people understand what we're talking about. And I want to start with the government of Iran. Now, it says it's a republic elected by the people, and it also says it's a theocracy, which is run by the Quran. Which is it?
Well, this is actually one of the key issues I think the regime in Tehran still really hasn't properly answered for. On paper, they say they are an Islamic republic, which means people have voted this system in. That they have elections, and they have elections for the parliament, they have elections for, to choose their president and so forth. And that part of it is fine. I mean, it is in that sense democratic. Certainly, if you compare it to some of the other states in the Middle East, the Iranians are democratic. But the problem is, if you actually look closely at the Iranian system, you then discover very quickly how managed this Iranian democracy is. For instance, the most powerful individual in the Iranian setup is the supreme leader, currently an individual by the name of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, not to be confused with Khomeini, who founded the republic back in 1979. So the supreme leader is basically the decisive voice when it comes to almost anything that's strategically important, including Iran's nuclear program, Iran's relations with the United States, and so forth. And this individual is not elected by the people of Iran. He's kind of a pope of Shia Muslims, and he is not elected by the voters. And right now in Iran, interestingly enough, the big fight is whether, the supreme leader's opponents can basically make him change his ways. And I hope we can get to that, because I think that's...
Well, I do want to get to it because there was an election as in 2009 that at least a number of Iranians and probably a lot of people around the globe, I want to get your view on it, believe was stolen, was fixed. At the time, Ahmadinejad was the favorite of the supreme leader, Khamenei, and there were enough people that believed it was fixed that they went out in the streets, they challenged it, and some call that the Green Revolution. Since that time, a lot of journalists have been imprisoned, a lot of bloggers have been imprisoned or even executed. Interesting, the favored guy of the supreme leader, Ahmadinejad, now appears to be on the outs with him. So it sounds like that the supreme leader is very much in control, or far more in control than the electoral mechanism. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, the supreme leader decides basically who he wants in the presidency. And at the moment, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the incumbent, cannot run again for office. Iran's constitution allows a president to sit in office for 2 terms, each time for 4 years. So Ahmadinejad's time is up, but he's adamant. He wants somebody from his faction, from his group, to be able to stand in the elections that will take place in June of this year. And Khamenei's people, the supreme leader's people, are saying to Ahmadinejad pretty much that that's not going to be allowed to happen. And in turn, Ahmadinejad's saying, well, if you're not going to let one of my people run, we're going to start rocking the boat. We're going to spill the beans, and you're going to have a fight on your hands. So that's what I was trying to explain before. Elections in Iran are held, but are extremely tightly managed. And the individual who manages the elections is this unelected individual, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. The trouble for him right now is whether he's got enough political capital and muscle to pull through, because he's now been hit from the populist wing, from Ahmadinejad's people, and he still has to deal with what we saw in 2009, the great masses of Iranians who want reform, major reform, in the shape of the Green Opposition and the rest of them.
Do they have any voice? I know a blogger, I've forgotten his name right now, but was recently murdered, who challenged the regime. How free can anyone oppose the regime in Iran?
I think the blogger you might be referring to is a guy called Beheshti.
Yes, Beheshti.
Yeah, he found himself basically criticizing the regime in the social media, and Persian speakers on social media are a major phenomenon. Persian is one of the largest, most extensive languages used online, and a lot of it is about debating the political shortcomings of their country. And this guy ended up being arrested, and next thing you know, he was dead. Now, the regime in Iran is not as, say, reckless as, say, Saddam Hussein's was in the 1990s, where you will be picked up randomly in the street and next thing you know, your body will be found. They are much cleverer than that. They try not to leave fingerprints everywhere. But the fact is, if you do stand up, particularly if you stand up and oppose someone like the supreme leader, you will be harmed. Whether you'll be harmed physically, certainly you'll be undermined politically, and Ahmadinejad is discovering that right now. Some of his closest advisors have been arrested, and this is actually the most interesting fight that's happening right now in Iran. It's not between the supreme leader and the Green Opposition; it's between the supreme leader and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So Mahmoud Ahmadinejad traveled from being Khamenei's chosen candidate in 2009, somebody that Khamenei said has God's blessing, to within a few years being labeled by Khamenei as Satan's basically child.
Right.
And that's an amazing transformation for anybody. But that's what Ahmadinejad's gone through, and he's made that just because he's challenged Khamenei. He says to Khamenei, "I'm elected by the people, you're not." And that's what the fight right now is about.
How much power does Khamenei actually have? Is it individual to him, or is it the power of the entire cleric class, as it were, the imams and others that are in the government, that control the government? Can Khamenei ever be replaced other than by age or sickness, or does he have a pretty firm lock on the country?
I mean, look, let me first say one thing which is very important for us to recognize, and that is the Iranian setup, the political setup, on surface looks kind of democratic with checks and balances. So on paper, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, can be removed by an assembly of experts. These are 86 learned Shia clergymen, similar to, say, the Council of Cardinals that just recently chose the Pope. So this system in Iran has an organ called the Assembly of Experts, and they can get together and say, we don't think the supreme leader is doing a good job.
But can Khamenei get rid of some of those experts if he thinks they're going to oppose him?
Exactly, and that's where we get into politics.
Yeah, when you can choose the people who choose you, they hardly have a choice.
Well, it's true. Actually, Assembly of Experts, you do have elections, so people do choose who sits in the Assembly of Experts, and I don't think we can make the case that all those 86 people are in Khamenei's pocket. That's not the case, but a lot of them are loyalists. But the trouble here is this: how do we go and assess their views about where they stand on Khamenei? I think most people, most analysts would agree that there's a lot of anger at a lot of the decisions Khamenei has made in recent years. Among the clergy, particularly, there's a lot of anger for his initial support for Ahmadinejad, who has now come out and is undermining the clergy in Iran. But the Assembly of Experts has never acted in a way where it's confronted the supreme leader, and that's the problem. If you're the supreme leader, unless you are being pressed hard enough within the structures of the regime, why are you going to be incentivized to change your ways? And I don't think right now Khamenei believes he needs to change his ways. Right now he's setting himself up for the June elections, and he wants to pick somebody who is going to basically do exactly as he says. So another Ahmadinejad, but this time without surprises.
Do the Iranian people have any say in this? I mean, I'm not talking about the clerics next to Khamenei, but the ordinary shopkeeper or student or in Tehran or even a farmer. Do they have any way to influence the government?
If you give him the right to come out and express a view, they have shown repeatedly that they choose reform. I mean, you got to go back to '97 when Mohammad Khatami came to power,
who seemed to be a fairly reasonable person. I wish that he'd been in power when Obama was president rather than Bush, because he seemed like a man the United States could deal with, and I mean, certainly someone who supported his country, but at the same time didn't have some of the, well, let's say more outlandish things that Ahmadinejad says.
Right. I mean, he was about sort of dialogue among civilizations.
Right.
Ahmadinejad is known for denying the Holocaust. Two very different sort of approaches to international policy. Absolutely agree.
Right.
By the way, Khatami could be candidate. I mean, just
really? Could he be? Because I thought he upset the supreme leader and therefore would have no chance of getting past the electoral board.
Well, this is exactly where we get into the sort of details of the Iranian system that makes it all exciting at times for us observers to watch. So in the Iranian election system, you got an organization called the Guardian Council. This is basically a regime filter. There are 12 individuals who sit in this council, and these 12 individuals decide who can run for office and who cannot run for office.
Right.
They also have other powers, including, rejecting legislation that the president of parliament wants to implement. They can reject it out of hand without saying why. They just basically say, no, we don't think this is good enough, or we don't like it. These 12 individuals, and this is why Iran is a theocracy and not a democracy, these 12 individuals are not voted in by the people. They are selected by the supreme leader. 6 of them are selected directly by the supreme leader, and 6 of them are sent there by the head of the judiciary. But the head of the judiciary, in turn, owes his job to the supreme leader. So the supreme leader, Khamenei, decides through the Guardian Council who can run for office in Iran. And that's why the Iranian democratic experiment kind of falls down on its head. But Khamenei does have the power to sometimes loosen the grip and say, you know what, I'm going to take a gamble. Let some, candidates like Khatami to run. He did that in '97, and Khatami got, I think, 63% of the vote.
He seemed to be very popular, and actually someone who reached out to have a dialogue with America. I was sort of hopeful about him. Like I said, unfortunately, I think our leaders didn't take up that chance when we could have. But let me ask you this: Khamenei, how old is he? Is this really someone who's going to be around until he dies or gets very sick? And is there any hope for a better supreme leader after he's gone?
Well, let me tell you this. I believe he's 73.
Oh, he's still pretty young.
He's pretty young.
By those terms.
If you're hoping for a sort of Benedict XVI resignation type of development, anything that I see come out of Tehran contradicts that. I don't think that's going to happen.
He's going to hang on till he dies.
He's going to hang on to it. He's going to try and see if he can sort of pass it on to the next supreme leader. How that's going to happen, we don't know. But if anything, he believes that you've got to be on the offensive against your internal and external opponents. That seems to be approach right now. He's even talking about turning Iran into a North Korea.
Great.
If that's what it takes for him to pull through with the nuclear program, he says, you know what, let them all cut us loose.
Well, that actually gives a nice segue to Iran and its nuclear threat, and also its threats abroad. Iran is playing a role, I wonder if you agree, in the Syrian conflict with Hezbollah, and with what is Iran doing there?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody can dispute the fact that Iran is heavily involved in Syria, and they publicly say that. They look at Syria as an ally. But what's important here is that Syria is not an ideological ally. I mean, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, we often in the U.S. talk about him as Shia regime, but they're a Ba'athist socialist regime. There's no ideology that brings the Iranian system and the Syrians together, except the fact that they both believe and practice political violence and political repression. But the Iranians believe that if they lose Syria, they've lost geopolitically on the Middle Eastern map, a significant ally.
And that's why they're supporting the regime.
That's what they're supporting.
With all of that context, let's now go to the nuclear question. Do you believe Iran is building a nuclear weapon? Do you think or do you think they're trying to obtain nuclear power for peaceful purposes?
I don't think right now it would make sense to most of us to believe that everything Iran is doing in the realm of its nuclear activities is purely intended for civilian purposes. That's the line that comes out of Tehran. I don't think what Iran, the regime, has been willing to go through in terms of sanctions and other costs that they have had to pay, that it would make sense to just say this is for the generation of electricity only. So I have a hard time believing the regime. Having said that, there is no smoking gun. The evidence isn't there that there is a bomb being built as we speak. I mean, the Iranian nuclear program has been under scrutiny since 2002, and probably before then. We certainly know about it in the public domain since 2002, and there's been many inspections done and so forth. And as you know, numerous U.S. intelligence assessments have said, they seem to want to have that option, but they're not working actively toward it. And I'm an open source guy. I don't have access to the intelligence. I can only guess that that's what seems to be what they want, to have the option, the kind of Japan option of a bomb in the basement. If we have to turn around and make a bomb fairly quickly for whatever purpose, we can do it, but we shouldn't do it right now because the penalties, the costs are too high. There's too much limelight on us right now.
How quickly could they take the highly enriched uranium that they have and develop a bomb, if they went to? Is it a matter of weeks, months, years?
Listen to the recent statements by President Obama to an Israeli television. He said, they're a year or so away. But you get kind of skeptical. I've been hearing this.
I've been hearing a year or so away for about 3 years now. So,
we keep changing that, and that actually doesn't help us. That doesn't help the argument, because those of us who genuinely believe proliferation in the Middle East is a bad thing, we've got to start, making sure people take us seriously when we say proliferation is a bad thing.
Now, why is proliferation a bad thing? There are people that say, hey, Iran's a sovereign nation. The United States has nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. China, Pakistan, India has nuclear weapons. North Korea, which clearly is not a sanely run country and just threatened, in fact, to nuke the United States. They have nuclear weapons. What is the danger if Iran actually becomes weeks away from developing a bomb?
As you know, there's a whole debate going on around this, that whether, this is the end of the world as we know it, or whether Iran can be contained. After all, as you mentioned, a number of states in that region, including Pakistan, Israel, and others, have nuclear weapons. And, that's the argument. There's a debate going around this issue on a daily basis. I personally think it doesn't even serve Iran's own interest if they became a nuclear armed state.
Why not?
Because I think a number of the neighboring states will probably start pursuing a weapons capability much more forcefully.
Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia.
The ones that are
Qatar.
Serious candidates are Saudi Arabia and Turkey at this moment.
Turkey for sure, yeah.
Yeah, Egypt, I don't think they got serious economic issues unless they get help from others, including Saudi Arabia. I wonder if they can afford it at this moment. But the Iranians, because of the size of the country, look, if you look on the map of the Middle East, Iran is a country of 78 million people. You just mentioned Qatar. Qatar has got a indigenous population of 200,000 people.
Right, barely anyone.
You don't need a nuclear weapon to be able to say to the Qataris that, look, you're going to show us some respect, if that's what Iran wants, which is what they say they want. In turn, if Qatar of 200,000 people decided to go and buy itself an arsenal of nuclear arms, which they can afford given the gas wealth that they have, then again, does that do Iran any good? And I would say no, it doesn't. So they are much better off remaining, integrated in the region to the extent that they can be. They're obviously increasingly isolated these days, but this is something that can be undone, and I think that would serve certainly Iranian national interest better. But the question here is, what's Iranian national interest versus the regime's interests? And Khamenei is putting himself first. The supreme leader and his people are putting their own grip on the sort of power in Tehran first. And it seems to be that they're saying, if we can get ourselves closer to this nuclear capability, even if we decide not to weaponize, we will get the kind of immunity, insurance policy that we will not sort of fall the way, say, Gaddafi fell in Libya, that we can become a North Korea. We might be annoying people, but they won't dare to come and remove us from power. That seems to be what...
So I think what you're saying is that the nuclear weapon isn't so much directed externally, although maybe it is. We'll get to that in a second. But that it's largely internal. In other words, the Supreme Leader fears his own people. The Green Revolution happened. It could have overthrown the Iranian government. After all, we've seen Arab Spring in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, and it's happening in Syria right now. And that by having a nuclear weapon, he can be ensured that the Iranian people will never take control of their government because he could just nuke them. Is that what you, or at least threaten to? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think the regime in Tehran is suicidal. I don't think if they had, say for the sake of a scenario, they had a bomb tomorrow, that they're going to drop it on anyone's head. I really do not believe that's the case. I think they want to hang on to power and sort of eat this cake that they have now had their hands on for the last 34 years called Iran. And I think you're right. I think there's a huge element of the domestic factors that play into this. It gets him some sort of a security. In his mind, probably a nuclear-capable Iran. And an Iran that is capable to weaponize will be respected in Washington to the degree that Washington might have second thoughts about, for instance, promoting human rights in Iran, which is something, for Khamenei, human rights means lesser power and lesser political influence for him and his people. So that's how he probably looks at it as well. Now, it's also important to remember the Iranian nuclear program began
under the Shah, I believe.
Under the Shah, in the middle of the 19th. I mean, after the Indian nuclear explosion of 1974, a number of states, including Iran, Pakistan, others, started seriously considering a nuclear weapons capability.
So to what extent is some of this a matter of pride for Persian people, for the people of Iran? I mean, you're a native of Iran. Do you believe that some of this is simply, hey, we want to be a nuclear power too. We are certainly a proud people with a very long and illustrative history for thousands and thousands of years. Why shouldn't we be a nuclear power? Is some of that pride going on, or do you think it's more the intricacies of a government trying to hang on?
No, I think pride is definitely an element, and I can tell you the regime in Tehran tries its utmost to tap into that nationalist pride, which is there. It's real. We all know it's there. There are many people in the country who cannot stand the regime, but on the nuclear issue support it and say, we've been bullied. We've been told that there are certain technologies we shouldn't have, that there's a world of haves and have-nots. Why are they picking on us? That's exactly the kind of argument you can read in Iranian state-run outlets. But I don't think the Iranians have ever, as a nation, as a public, had the debate about the costs versus the sort of benefits of a nuclear program as is being run right now.
One of the costs is sanctions. Are they working?
Sanctions. I mean, sanctions cost them 2012 alone. Iran had to pay $50 billion. Half of its oil income disappeared because of sanctions. That's a lot of money. Now you can produce electricity. But you got to ask yourself the question: is this the right way to go about it?
But here's the question: do the sanctions harm the regime in control, or do they just harm ordinary Iranians? I mean, are they effective in doing what they're designed to do, which is persuading Iran not to develop a nuclear weapon?
Again, this is one that's being debated right now. There are no hard answers, and we can't really prove this at this moment scientifically. I mean, there are things we can point to, say this is clearly as a result of the sanctions. To give you one example, the Iranian currency has dropped by 70%, again, over the course of 2012. 70%. That this is not a country that's used to having its currency fluctuate to this extent. So sanctions clearly have an impact. Inflation is running amok in Iran. Things cost 4 times as much as they did a year ago. So again, sanctions have an impact. But the United States is pursuing a policy, as far as I know, to prevent a sort of a scenario that we witnessed in Iraq in the 1990s with starving kids and devastated local economies. So they're trying to pursue a sanction policy that's targeted. Now, we can debate whether you can have smart sanctions. And again, I don't know all the answers to that. But for me, the critical factor is this: how long is this going to continue?
Well, that's my ultimate question. We only have a couple minutes left. How is this going to continue? Will sanctions persuade the regime to stop? Obama has said he will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Is this going to end in some use of force by the United States or Israel or someone else? What do you think should happen? You're against nuclear proliferation. How should the West react?
Well, I mean, to be very blunt and quick about it, since we're short of time, I think right now the sanctions that are in place are probably the worst, the best of the worst options we got in front of us. I mean, I think for the United States to get engaged in a military conflict right now against Iran in the Middle East would not be a good development. The U.S. can't really afford it. Well, it can afford it, but it's probably should be something that should be further down on the list. I think proliferation is a serious matter, should be pursued, and you would hope that the regime in Tehran would take the sanctions and everything else that's coming at them from the international community seriously. And next time there are negotiations taking place, and there will be more of them coming up, they start providing serious concessions. Nobody at this point is asking Iran to give up its nuclear program. The West, the United States, is simply saying be transparent about it.
Let the inspectors in, the IAEA, let them find out what's going on.
Exactly. Now, if you can reach a compromise on that, that would at least remove the imminence of a military conflict with Iran. That does not remove the fact that the regime in Tehran is still repressing its own people, and I think the United States should pursue a policy of keeping the pressure on when it comes to violations of human rights and all the things associated with that. But at least on the nuclear front, we can remove the likelihood of a military confrontation in the foreseeable future. But you still have to deal with bad behavior on the part of the Iranian regime in a whole host of areas, and I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. And not as long as we have Khamenei in power in Tehran. Mr.
Vatanka, that was a fascinating conversation and outlook. I could go on with you for hours, but I want to get to my next guest, who's Jamal Abdi, the policy director for the National Iranian American Council. So thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing your perspective. And folks, if you want to dial in and join in the discussion, you can do so. It's 202-889-9797. This is Mark Levine. This is the Inside Scoop. We'll be right back with Jamal Abdi right after this. Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine having a fascinating 2-hour discussion on the situation in Iran, everything that's going on the ground, what the government is doing, to what Western policymakers should or should not do about whether Iran is developing or not developing nuclear weapons. These are tough questions, and I'm posing them to really a terrific panel. The next guest is Jamal Abdi. He's the policy director for the National Iranian American Council. Mr. Abdi, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming here. So I think you had a chance to hear some of my prior discussion with Alex Vatanka, and I want to know sort of where you agree or disagree. Let me start on the nature of the regime in Iran, and then we'll get to the nuclear question in just a bit. Do you accept his thesis that Iran is, well, let's just say a repressive regime, which is the words he used?
Yeah, I didn't hear his portion on that, but
okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the UN just came out with its latest report from the special rapporteur, who's a gentleman designated with having to report sort of annually on what the human rights situation is, and clearly it's bad. There are human rights lawyers in jail. They're increasingly putting journalists in jail, accusing them of being involved in some sort of cloak and dagger scheme because they're tied to the BBC.
The BBC, the British Broadcasting Service.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is not true, or at least not that I know of.
Right.
So they're just making up threats against journalists. One of the things that got a little bit of attention was the jailing and murder and threats to a young blogger, Beheshti, I think was his name.
Yeah, Sattar Beheshti.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this is a young guy who was not really a prominent or well-known blogger, but he had written some things that were critical of the regime, and for one reason or another, somebody found out about it and didn't like it within the IRGC, I believe.
The Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Don't use initials here. Got to spell it out for people. Gotcha.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
But anyway, somebody didn't like what he was writing, so they arrested him and brought him to Levine prison, which is sort of this notorious prison outside of Tehran, where a lot of, in 2009 when there were the uprisings, Levine became the sort of the hub of these detainments of dissidents and people who had been accused of being involved in, facilitating these uprisings against the regime in the post-election sort of clampdown that was occurring. But anyway, they brought this blogger into the jail, and lo and behold, a couple of days later, it was discovered that he had been killed, and apparently he had been tortured to death. And this actually it sparked some sort of international outcry, and the government actually launched an investigation and sort of claimed that there were concerns about what had happened. They wanted to make sure that he wasn't tortured.
As I recall, they first denied that it happened, and then when the pressure came more from outside, then they launched an investigation and said they were some renegade jailers or something like that.
Yeah, and some low level people have been charged with being involved in that. So that sort of goes on. But this is a pattern that we've seen where these cases they sort of become news outside of Iran, and the pressure from the international community has actually led the Iranian government to back down, or at least create the appearance that they were looking into these things and putting a halt to them. This happened a couple years ago. There was this sort of famous case in which a woman was going to be stoned to death for alleged she was cheating on her husband or something, and this got picked up internationally, and there was a lot of outcry, and they ended up canceling this, and it was this very embarrassing, I think, for the Iranian government.
Now, the government, you mentioned the 2009 revolution, many people call it the Green Revolution, where there was an election. It was the election that put Ahmadinejad in power for a second term. The regime basically limited the people who could run, but notwithstanding that, the runner-up, who was definitely a regime supporter, hardly a radical or hardly a liberal Democrat, many believed that the election was fixed, and that caused people to pour out in the streets. Do you believe the election was fixed, and do you believe that there's any hope for a green revolution in Iran?
Yeah, I think that the election was fraudulent. I think it was fixed. I mean, people do need to understand, though, that there are elections inside of Iran. This is not Ahmadinejad in 2005 actually went up against a guy named Rafsanjani, who was sort of the consummate regime insider, and he beat him out. And so there are these elections that take place. People, in the past at least, have voted in very large numbers, much larger than we do over here. But in 2009, it was clear that the supreme leader did not want Mousavi, the challenger, to win. In the weeks preceding the election, there was sort of this. A lot of people who were there at the time, they described the atmosphere as being something they hadn't seen in Tehran in a long time, which is there were sort of like street celebrations and people, young people sort of just rallying, and there would just be these sort of impromptu rallies, and women would be going around without their their scarves on and things like that. And anyway, there was sort of this like celebratory atmosphere leading up to the election, where this really felt like it wasn't just a presidential campaign, but it was actually a movement of young people, and they were going to get rid of Ahmadinejad, and they were going to potentially start turning things around on social issues and things like that.
Sounds a little bit like the Arab Spring, which has succeeded obviously in some governments. Is that what the supreme leader fears, an Arab Spring or Persian Spring, shall we say, in Iran?
Yeah, well, and this was before the Arab Spring.
Right, a few months before. That's true.
I think that this is something that the Supreme Leader and the higher-ups really do have to figure, because they have a very, Iran, it's a young population, and a lot of those young people are out of sync with what the regime is sort of built on, which is this, this revolutionary, anti-American, anti-imperial, whatever, sort of mentality that a lot of Iran's young people, they were born after the Shah was deposed, and born after a lot of these events that inform the nature of the Iranian government. So they want to be a part of the outside world. They want to be connected, and they don't understand why their government acts this way. So I think that that's a big concern for the Supreme Leader. I think that the real takeaway is that I don't think that this sort of system is sustainable.
That's my ultimate question. Will the Green Revolution or something like it in 5-10 years, I guess not 1 year, but is there hope for an Iranian democracy? I mean, it seems to me that certainly the people of Tehran are they're well educated. They are not supporting a lot of the Iranian support for the Bashar Assad regime or Hezbollah or terrorism around the globe. It seems like the people of Iran, by the way, at least all the ones I've met, are some of the most pro-American people in the Middle East. So there does seem to be a disconnect. You have actual hope that the Iranian people can reclaim their government?
Yeah, I have real hope that Iran will become a representative government, and that that the people of Iran, that is ultimately what they want, although it's not necessarily that they want to overthrow the regime and have a total, I don't want to speak for the Iranian people. That's, I guess, what I want to say.
Fair enough. I mean,
I think a lot of people do that, but I do think that this is unsustainable. I do think that there's a lot of hope about what the people of Iran can achieve as far as changing the nature of this government. And I honestly think that the only way that you sustain the system as it currently stands is through what we're doing right now, with the threats of war, with the sanctions, with creating this sort of this hostile situation. That is how you prolong a revolutionary government like this one, and make it so that it is never reformed, and people on the inside are never able to sort of build this critical mass to change the direction of the regime.
Well, yeah, let's go there, because I think that's the heart of the question. I think that most people of goodwill in the United States, in Iran, around the globe, recognize that Iran's repressive regime support, to the extent we could, the Green Revolution. Frankly, I would have liked to have seen stronger support from our government for that when it happened. And we all want to see the people succeed. But at the same time, the regime is doing something with nuclear power. I'll let you tell me what you think they're doing. And the question is whether or not, if they ever were to develop nuclear weapons, or at least to be a month away, as they say, or a week away from developing a bomb, that might actually prevent the Iranian people from ever taking charge. That's actually what Mr. Vatanka argued. He said that that he thinks the Supreme Leader thinks like the leader of North Korea, that if he can just develop nuclear weapons, that's his insurance policy against a revolution. So, which is it? Do sanctions push us, and the threat of force push us away from this conclusion that we all want, or does actually Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon push away from this conclusion we all want?
I don't actually, frankly, understand the notion that a nuclear weapon would keep the Supreme Leader in his current job title. I don't see how that's...
Vatanka's view, as he put it, was that we could take out Saddam Hussein, we could take out Gaddafi, but there can never be a revolution in Iran if he's got nuclear weapons. That was his way of putting it.
That argument is predicated on the notion that it's going to take us to take out the Supreme Leader. It's going to take some sort of external intervention in order to get rid of the government, and I don't think that that's the right way to look at it. I don't think that if Iran ever does become a democracy or a representative government, that it's going to be a result of outside powers coming in and dictating that, or frankly, even helping facilitate that. I think really, I have faith in the people of Iran that they are able to achieve that. They've done it before. 1979 was not. It didn't start out as an Islamic revolution. It didn't start out as necessarily what has become what was on the other side of the toppling of the Shah. But people have been through that before inside of Iran. and they can do it again. And if we're involved, we're going to screw it up.
I guess the concern is that the Green Revolution, had it gone farther, would have ended up in a situation very close to what we have in Syria, where we have, huge massacres of innocent people and millions of refugees, and a regime that certainly does not seem to be popular, but nevertheless is holding on by just sheer brutality. Obviously, that would be a horrific thing to happen to the country of Iran. How can peacefully the Supreme Leader ever give up power?
Yeah. The one thing I don't think that is in the cards, at least I hope is not in the cards, is that we go to this scenario where there's this violent revolution. I think most Iranians
that would be horrible.
That lived through the 1979 revolution, they have little appetite for doing even that again, and that maybe things have changed since 2009 because of the serious repression and the use of violence to silence people. But I think that the mindset of Iranians is that this is a long-term process. This is not something that we're going to do overnight. But the sentiments are there. The organization's not necessarily there. But we are going to achieve, an eventual democracy or a representative government through reform and through a more gradual process, and that the system is just not sustainable. But if we go to, if they were to go to a violent revolution, if, as has happened in Syria, it becomes not a peaceful movement, but something in which violence has been injected, I don't know that that's a winnable battle. I don't know that that is fighting for democracy on the terms of, I think, the government, where they're strongest in the use of force, versus where the people are strongest, which is in terms of justice and having mass mobilization. And so the Syria model, I think I'm glad that that's actually what people are realizing is what they're advocating for when they talk about, an armed revolution against the government, because Syria is not going to produce democracy.
Well, of course, Syria, to be fair to the Syrian people, they certainly they tried to do it peacefully. They certainly did not take up arms against the government. The government took up arms against them, and of course we're not arming them now. So it's certainly not the Syrian people's fault on that. But getting back to Iran, let me ask you about the nuclear program. Do you believe that what do you believe is the purpose of the Iranian nuclear program?
Well, I think that, first of all, if Iran wanted a nuke, they would have one by now. They've got thousands of centrifuges. I mean, isn't that what they're doing? That's not. You can't bomb somebody with centrifuges.
That's true.
Now, I think that. So, if they wanted one, they would have one. I don't think that there is a unified view within the government. I don't think the Supreme Leader has made up his mind about what he wants out of this. I think in the initial phases, it was sort of, when it started in the late 80s, early 90s, it was sort of exploratory. It was, okay, let's see what our options are as far as moving towards becoming a nuclear weapon state. I think that in the early 2000s, it was actually used by, there were some people on the conservative side who maybe wanted to push for a nuclear weapon. There were people on the more liberal reformist side who actually thought that the nuclear program was a good bargaining chip to be able to open up talks with the United States and use this as a way to actually undo some of the isolation of Iran and bring the two sides to the table and sort of open up Iran to the world by, maybe giving this program up. And I think that now it's a big question mark as to, okay, if I'm in Tehran, what can I actually get out of having this program? Is it worth continuing down this path where basically they're pursuing nuclear latency? They're pursuing this ability to maybe, be a month or 2 weeks away from being able to break out and develop a weapon. Or is it worth actually scaling this back and putting it under tighter controls in order to, end the sanctions and possibly explore ways that Iran can sort of change its position in the international community and, sort of restore its role within the Middle East as being a player in the region.
Well, so are the sanctions then encouraging Iran? Well, I guess what direction are they encouraging Iran? You seemed to say at the beginning that you felt that the sanctions were the worst thing because they were pushing Iran in a more militaristic direction. Without sanctions, how do you propose the supreme leader says he's a divine leader. He says that that he's in fact the leader of all the Muslims, which obviously even the Shia are not the majority of Muslims. That the people of Iran, at one point he said, were minors, meaning like children in need of guidance. How do you persuade such a person not to undergo any kind of nuclear program when, if not using sanctions?
Yeah, I think that sanctions can be part of a strategy, but at the center has to be the use of diplomacy. And I think that the order has been reversed, in which we're primarily focused on sanctions, and military threats and things like that, and diplomacy has been an afterthought. And you ask the question, are the sanctions working? Well, no. I mean, what's the goal of the sanctions? The goal is to try to either get Iran to accept caps on its enrichment, or we don't even know. It hasn't been defined. What are the sanctions supposed to be doing? How are we supposed to know if they're working?
We're trying to persuade Iran to allow inspectors from the IAEA to come in and make sure that the nuclear program is for peaceful means. I think that's the goal.
But even that is not. It has not been articulated, and that's important because I really think that the view from Tehran is they don't know where this ends. So
what should our goal be?
So our goal is actually what you just said. There are inspectors in Iran. We need more inspections. We need for the Iranians to sign on to what's called the additional protocol, which is something that they were signed on to, and they exited in 2006 after it became clear. They signed on to the additional protocol basically as part of these negotiations to show good faith and to say, look, we're not committed to moving forward with this nuclear program in a way that's not demonstrably civilian and peaceful. We are actually willing to put safeguards on it. And what happened was the Europeans, who were handling the negotiations at that time and sort of acting as our proxies, came back and said, well, actually, we want you to just not have a nuclear program. We don't want you to have enrichment on your soil. So, you suspended enrichment. We actually want that to be permanent, or we're not willing to negotiate with you if you restart that. And so the real question here is, okay, yes, we want more inspections, but are we going to be okay with Iran having any enrichment? And that's why the Iranians are always saying they want their nuclear rights recognized.
Well, why does Iran need enrichment? One of the proposals, as I recall, I think it was about 2-3 years ago, and it was going to use the Soviet Union and Brazil, and the idea was to take away the fissile material that could be used to create a bomb, and in return, give Iran the low-level material that they claimed they needed to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. I never understood why that deal didn't go through if Iran is truly acting in good faith.
Well, part of that deal, it did go through, and we turned it down. In 2010, there was a deal that it was sort of a revisiting of that deal. It was the Tehran Declaration. Brazil and Turkey went in and tried to basically get part of this, and we turned it down because we wanted to do UN sanctions, and we thought, well, we'll do the sanctions, and then we'll come back to the table. But the reason, at the heart of this, why does Iran need enrichment? Well, I don't think they do need enrichment, but I do understand.
Is it pride?
The reasoning here.
Is that mostly what it is? Pride?
Maybe it's pride, but it's also it's the notion that Iran has the right to these activities, and that Iran is a country that it actually really values technological and scientific achievements, and views itself historically as being at the forefront of science and technology.
And certainly the Persian people have been, no question, for thousands of years. But if they get nukes, then why not Saudi Arabia? Why not really any country, right?
Well, yeah, and we need to figure out where is that overlap? Where, okay, they get what they view as their right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we view as giving enough lead time to where if they decided to, okay, this isn't working, we're going to kick out inspectors and build a bomb, we have enough time to actually stop that from happening. So where is that overlap? We need to figure that out, because I think this idea that Iran's going to give up its enrichment and be part of this sort of international consortium, the history of Iran, whether we're talking the 20, 30-year history or the 200, 300, 500-year history, is that Iran has not had a good experience being dependent on outside powers. It has been, because of its position, it's geographic position, because of the politics of the area. Iran has been invaded many times. It has been, as far as the nuclear deals are concerned, it has been sort of, it has had deals with France and with the U.S. to develop its civilian nuclear program under the Shah. Those were reneged on. So there's just a total lack of trust that Iran should be put at the in a dependent state on outside powers who have historically, in the mind of Iranians, betrayed them. So I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think that's a non-starter.
But then it sounds like Iran's not really interested in diplomacy and is stringing along people in order to develop the plan and become like North Korea. Get that plan, get in place, and then say, hey, you can't harm us now. We can do whatever we want. We can do terrorist attacks, Hezbollah, and you can't stop us because we got nukes. Which seems to be North Korea's path. Is that a path that Iran may well go down?
I think that's a possibility. I would not rule that out. I think that there's a danger that we are going to end up in a situation where that happens. But I think that that's not on the trajectory we're on. There are a few options, and there is the option of actually putting caps in place. Getting Iran to sign on to the additional protocol, getting
but
Iran.
What incentive do they have to do that? I guess is my question. I mean, it seems to me that you want to try more diplomacy, which are words. I don't know how President Obama or John Kerry's persuasive power is any different from Hillary Clinton's persuasive power. I mean, do you really think that saying, "Hey, Iran, just stop it"? I mean, how is this actually going to work here?
Well, we have to look at this big picture. I mean, yeah, Hillary Clinton. Under Hillary Clinton, we talked to the Iranians in bilaterals once. So that's not going to be enough to fix this, and there have to be real moves on both sides, real concessions. I think we're on the brink of a potential breakthrough.
Really.
There were talks last month. There are going to be technical talks. Actually, I think today is when they're happening, or maybe tomorrow. There are going to be technical talks, and then there's going to be a new round of talks in Kazakhstan early next month. And what has happened is, both sides are sort of talking about this as a new paradigm for the talks, in which real concessions have been put forward on our side, and we have laid out what concessions the Iranians need to make in order to achieve those. And those concessions do involve sanctions relief.
Well, of course. I mean, I don't think the purpose of sanctions is for anything but to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program, and we have no desire to sanction Iran just to sanction Iran.
Right. But until now, we haven't been willing to, in the past talks, we have not been willing to ease up on the sanctions, because the notion was the only reason Iran's going to concede is because they're going to have been intimidated to concede. And if we give up sanctions as part of that, then they have no incentive to concede the next round when it comes down to bigger concessions that need to be made.
Well, see, but that's a point here. Are you saying that we need to ease up on sanctions before we get anything from Iran? Because that would seem to be counterproductive as well, wouldn't it?
No. We need the sanctions are the reality now. I think that the sanctions have sort of taken us on a little bit of they've sidetracked the diplomatic process, and basically what we're doing now is we're saying, okay, the sanctions that we have been passing over the past 2 years, we're willing to start easing up on those if you give up some of the nuclear progress that you've made over the last 2 years. And basically, it's going to bring us back to where we were in 2010 as far as the level of sanctions and the level of Iran's nuclear enrichment and capabilities.
So you think that's a possibility, that Iran might agree to something like the Brazil, Turkey, Russia deal, where they give up their highly enriched uranium in return, we reduce the sanctions or eliminate them, something like that?
Yeah, I think if we're willing to leverage those sanctions in exchange for some concessions, I think that the Iranians are willing to, I mean, they've said it publicly, they're willing to stop this 20% enrichment, which is this higher level of enrichment that they started doing in 2010 after we started passing new sanctions.
And they'd be willing to let the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, actually come in and monitor to make sure they're keeping their word?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the IAEA is in there monitoring the 20% enrichment right now. The issue with the IAEA...
Well, they say that they're not allowed to see everything or follow everything.
So the issue with the IAEA is there's this military facility that, according to intelligence that has been passed on to the IAEA, Iran was doing explosives testing, possibly a decade ago, but at some point in the past, that could have been linked to a nuclear arms program. And so the IAEA wants to go to that military facility and do inspections, which they already have been to that military facility. They went there in, I think, 2005. Now they're saying, well, there's some other stuff that we need to do to investigate to see if there was actually, a nuclear weapons related testing going on there. So they want access to in order to do that. But that's separate from the current enrichment program. That's actually looking at Iran's past work to basically build up this this profile of, okay, what Iran was actually attempting to do before 2003, when they, according to the U.S. intelligence agencies, they gave up pursuing nuclear arms.
But and that's certainly what the intelligence agencies believe. But they also believe they started again, and they've moved some nuclear materials, I believe, from Natanz to an underground facility, some enrichment facility, and at least according to IAEA, are beefing up the centrifuges. It doesn't sound like Iran is putting any brakes on its program.
That's not true, though. Actually, it is still the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community and of the intelligence communities in all the Security Council states and in Israel. Iran has not. They do not have a weapons program. They are not.
Okay, well, let me make a distinction here, because it's a very difficult distinction to make. No one disputes, I don't believe you dispute, that Iran is highly enriching uranium and working hard to get as much highly enriched uranium as possible.
No, just they're actually they're not doing it above 20%. So that's not highly enriched. That's not weapons grade. That's low enriched uranium. That's for, it can only be used for civilian purposes.
Right, but my understanding is that moving from 5% to 20% is like 10 times more difficult than moving from 20% to 95%. That it's something where weeks or maybe months that
right.
It could happen.
But it's an important distinction between, because Chuck Schumer, for instance, he sent this letter out to his constituents where he said Iran's enriching to weapons grade, and they're not doing that. And that's really important, because if Iran did move to start enriching to weapons grade, that's a very provocative step. And it's my understanding that would cross the president's red line, and that would be grounds for a military strike. So Iran has been very careful to not cross those tripwires. And I agree with you, they are flirting with this. They are definitely trying to move to a situation in which they would have the capability to quickly break out and start enriching to weapons grade and producing materials that could be loaded into a nuclear warhead. But they have been very careful to not do that. And our goal needs to be to move them away from that point.
Last question, and I wish we had more time, but this has been a terrific conversation. And last question: if Iran were to move from 20% to weapons grade, how would we know about it in the time? In the weeks or it would take, or maybe months, to find out about it.
Yeah, so this was actually the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, just testified about this in the Senate, and he said we would know, if they did that, we would know in time to stop it. And the reason is, well, we have inspectors on the ground. We have IAEA inspectors who go into these facilities. They make, I think 2 or 3 visits per month to those facilities. Some of those are unannounced. Some of those are scheduled. The IAEA has cameras at all the enrichment facilities, including at the underground facility in Fordow, which you alluded to. So we have eyes on the ground at all of these facilities. If Iran decided that they were going to move to weapons grade, we would see it happen, and as it currently stands, it would take them a longer period to actually amass enough of that for one bomb's worth of materials. It would take longer than it would take for us to detect it. And then the other issue is that, look, even if they did do that, you can't just take weapons grade uranium and slingshot it at another country. You actually have to then put that into a warhead, miniaturize a nuclear warhead, then tip that on a ballistic missile. So it's a long process. We're still looking at a couple of years before Iran would be able to have a deliverable nuclear device. But to answer your question, we would be able to detect that initial move that would be necessary. We would be able to detect it before they were able to complete it.
Okay. Thank you very much for your views. I really do appreciate it. It's been a fascinating discussion. And next up, we're going to have someone who I believe disagrees with you, and that's part of what the discussion's all about. But thank you very, very much for coming here on the Inside Scoop.
It's a pleasure.
Up next is Matthew Brodsky. He is the Director of Policy at the Jewish Policy Center, the editor of In Focus Quarterly, and he believes we need to take stronger action against Iran. If you want to call in, it's 202-889-9797. We'll be back with Matt Brodsky right after this. Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. We're devoting 2 full hours on what's going on in Iran and what Western policymakers can or should do about it. Coming up next is Matthew Brodsky. He is the president and the director of policy at the Jewish Policy Center, the editor of In Focus Quarterly. Matt, welcome to the Inside Scoop.
Good to be with you. How you doing?
I'm good. So you heard, I think, just the last bit of my last guest, Jamal Abdi, and he insists that Iran has not developed the material necessary to build a nuclear weapon, and crucially, and this is the question I asked him at the very end, which I believe you heard, that he believes, and he says that our national security director, national intelligence director, James Clapper, said before Congress, we would know if they started to get to that last final step. Did you agree with that?
Who would actually be comfortable with that? I mean, does anyone actually trust American intelligence so much that we would be able to know that? And that seems like an awful risk to take. So, I mean, that should not make anyone feel better. I'm sure it doesn't make the United States or our European allies feel better. I'm not sure that makes any of our Arab allies. It doesn't make Israel feel better.
What is the danger of a nuclear Iran?
Well, as the leading state that sponsors terrorism around the globe and supporting Hezbollah and propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which has now killed over 70,000 people, the idea that they could export nuclear technology, nuclear weapons is very real. Now, when you match their rhetoric with their actions, and the rhetoric is to wipe Israel off the map, you realize that would be a very bad idea to allow them to have a nuclear weapon. That should be a non-starter, and that clearly should be the goal of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran. Now,
Iran says that they're not pursuing a weapon, and that they want it for peaceful purposes, and that it's about their I guess pride that they should. Well, everyone else has a nuclear weapon. Israel has a nuclear weapon. Pakistan has one. Why can't they have one too?
Well, if what they want, okay, those are two different points. One is, do they want a nuclear weapon? I believe yes. On the first part, though, if they're saying that they don't want a nuclear weapon, they just want the technology and they want to use it for, say, medical isotopes. Well, that's something that they could do by having the enrichment take place outside of Iranian soil. So, I mean, it's not credible. Not to mention the degree or the extent to which they would like to enrich the uranium, upwards of 20%, is just not necessary for anything other than military or nuclear weapon purposes. So it's quite clear that what they're after is a nuclear weapon. And as to why they should not have a nuclear weapon is if they're the greatest sponsor of terrorism and literally are just supporting every form of terrorist regime that's in the Middle East and even in Latin America, this is not a group that the United States can stand to have a nuclear weapon or that technology.
Okay, but what are the alternatives? We have sanctions. They appear to be working at least to the extent of harming the Iranian economy. The rial has dropped in value by 70%. Apparently, Iranians can't buy any imported goods. Can we have stronger sanctions, or is the only possibility to resort to military force?
Well, we certainly could have stronger sanctions. And again, we wasted 3 years and again took a pass at the whole helping out during the Green Revolution, as I think you were mentioning before, the 2009 election aftermath. So that was when, as soon as Obama became president, he could have gone with sanctions and used carrots and sticks. Instead, we're doing only carrots.
It's funny because Jamal Abdi says we're using only sticks. His point is that we haven't tried enough diplomacy, that we were too quick to use sanctions, and he felt that Iran would have agreed to the Brazilian Turkish deal to do exactly what you say, to move their highly enriched, or I won't say highly, let's say middle enriched uranium out and bring in the stuff they would need for health purposes. But he said that the United States didn't take that deal when it was offered, and that would have been the solution back in 2010. What's your view on that?
Well, he was also talking about how sanctions have been ineffective or effective. The problem is that they are effective if the metric you're using is how they are affecting the Iranian people. And the problem is they're having a great effect on the Iranian people. As you said, the rial has dropped off. It just took a nosedive. But is that affecting the regime's calculus when it comes to its nuclear program? And the answer is an emphatic no. So, yes, we can have more sanctions, but the idea that sanctions alone are going to, that they're the one element that's going to just change the calculus of the regime, it's proven not to be the case. Furthermore, sanctions over time have shown to disintegrate. So the sanctions, even if they were really, really strong, if they kept going for a few years, if Iran couldn't get a weapon, say, within a year, they would still deteriorate because other countries wouldn't be able to keep up with it. They would, it's the same thing that happened in Iraq for the whole decade of the 90s.
Let me ask you this. You're the Director of Policy for the Jewish Policy Center, and obviously one of the things I'm sure you're concerned with is the well-being of the Jewish people around the globe. Israel has said that Iran poses an existential threat, in other words, a threat to its very existence. Iran responds that Israel poses a threat to Iran, that Israel has nuclear weapons, and that Iran fears Israel, and that Iran needs nuclear weapons because Israel has nuclear weapons. How is someone who is not Israeli, not Iranian, not Jewish, not Muslim, how are they to evaluate these statements?
The Israelis?
Well, both. Well, because they're both hurling pretty much the same claim at each other, aren't they?
Right, but here's whether Israel does or does not have a nuclear weapon, based on the decades ago that it's thought that they would have had a nuclear weapon, what nuclear arms race did that spur in the Middle East? None.
But and Iran would be different.
What's that?
Iran would be different.
Well, Iran is absolutely different right now because now you have Saudi Arabia and other countries that are going to want a nuclear deterrent. So even the idea that if Israel had a nuclear weapon right now, the Arab states and Iran itself knew that Israel wasn't really going to use it, that's not something that they were going to introduce into the region, and that's been their position, that they wouldn't be the first to introduce a nuclear weapon into the conflict. So Israel having a nuclear weapon, if they do, then that's not something that spurred a nuclear arms race. Iran having a nuclear weapon would spur that. So it's...
What threat does Iran pose to Israel?
Well, it is existential, as Israel has said. I mean, and if you go according to the needing to bring the hidden imam back in Shia thinking, the idea that some form of Armageddon incident is not such a bad thing, and that's what Ahmadinejad is talking about when he would like to wipe Israel off the map. So, and it's not just a nuclear weapon being launched from missiles or anything like that. It's also giving that technology to Hezbollah, which is their group in Lebanon, and they had already started a war with Israel in 2006. So, and these are very, very real threats that Israel has to take very seriously.
So is it your view that a military strike by either the United States and or Israel is a necessity and it's going to occur and should occur soon?
I'm not saying it's a necessity, but I think we're conducting ourselves right now with one arm tied behind our back. There's no reason you can't have sanctions and you can't have diplomacy, but at the same time have a credible threat of military force. And right now that threat is not credible. There's no reason that the Iranian regime could actually think to itself that the United States is going to do something. We have a horrible messaging problem. We don't even know what our red line is. I heard one of the guests before speaking about, what is the red line? This administration doesn't have a red line. So Iran can't figure out what a red line is either.
So what makes it credible? Saying if you enrich past 35%, I'm just picking a sort of a random number, then there will be a military force use? Is that sort of red line?
That could be. I mean, Netanyahu, Prime Minister from Israel, went before the United Nations and had a chart with picture of a bomb that said 20%, above 20%. And that 20% enrichment is literally 70% of the effort required to create a nuclear weapon. So it's a little misleading, but that is the point that Netanyahu is trying to make. Once you've enriched uranium to 20%, you have a breakout capacity.
Okay.
And that has to be stopped. So either drawing a line at a specific percentage of enrichment, or you could say at such and such a date, this is it. We're not going to keep talking in circles. It's one thing for President Obama to say that we're not just going to keep talking for the sake of talking. But I don't know anyone who doesn't feel like we're just talking for the sake of talking right now, because the enrichment is continuing.
Some of my prior guests felt that when talking about the Green Revolution, and by the way, no one has been supportive of the Iranian regime. I'm glad to say that whatever people's views are on sanctions or military force, all of my guests have agreed that Iran is a repressive, dangerous regime that locks up and mistreats journalists and doesn't give human rights. So, and I was actually very pleased to hear Jamal Abdi of NIAC talk about the need for representative democracy in Iran. So we all agree on the goal. Their argument is that by taking aggressive action against Iran, whether it be sanctions for Jamal Abdi or whether it be military force for Alex Vatanka, that it actually pushes the Iranian people, whether for pride or nationalism or simply they don't want to see their country being bombed, it pushes them to support a regime they would not otherwise support. How do you respond to that?
I would respond to that by saying, okay, number one, that is a real issue. And again, the Iranian people are a great people. And, this is an issue of their regime. If we were to actually be using all of our foreign policy thinking, then we would have done something in 2009. We're not supporting the Green Revolution. So what's left.
Well, what could you have done? I mean, I watched those pictures. My heart went out to those people. I certainly, I would have liked to have seen the president.
We haven't learned from because we're still doing. It took way too long for us to do even the minimal amount of what we're doing in Syria. And back then, in Iran, that would have been satellite phones, even our information. It's not a matter of putting troops doing something militarily. It's supporting those people. So it's allowing them to communicate. We all remember the blackouts of communication, and it was incredibly hard to get information out through YouTube. And we could have helped them with communication. We could help them organize.
Is the Green Revolution dead? Are there embers still left? It definitely seems like there's a lot fewer protests than 2 years ago.
It's still there, but I mean, after you have that uprising, and this predates the so-called Arab Spring,
right?
And this was something that they rose up, and we did nothing. Our messaging was still at that point to the regime. This was something that President Obama changed over President Bush before. It used to be that our presidents would give New Year's greetings to Iran, and they would give it to the people, specifically to the people, and talk past the regime. President Obama came in and was still addressing the regime because he's thinking that through the power of his words alone, he would affect the regime's calculus when it came to nuclear weapons. That didn't happen. So when it comes to working with the people, we have a lot in common with the people, and the people of Iran, they obviously, as previous guests have said, don't like living under the regime that they have. They would be far better off without it. But so we should support those efforts. Unfortunately, by sitting on the sidelines, we helped weaken it, and we're still not doing enough now to help bolster it if we were serious about this.
Many Americans argue that post-Iraq, we just don't have credibility anymore, that as Jamal Abdi said, that it's up to the Iranian people to lead their own revolution, and the United States of America is after the invasion of Iraq, if we help, it actually harms the cause of democracy because it's seen as a foreign influence and not seen as native to the country. I want you to respond to that.
Well, okay, let's take a look at the example of Syria. Say, to begin with, they knew that Iran and Russia are propping up the Assad regime.
Right.
They were hoping for the United States to help. The United States didn't do anything, didn't lead. They just, apparently we decided that we were getting confused about what we should do in the Middle East, so we decided to do nothing for a very long time. The Syrians were burning Russian flags and Chinese flags, apparently because they've understood who was backing the regime and who wasn't. They were hoping that we were going to do something. We did nothing. So this is how, it can go one of two ways. Yes, it can be a damned if you do, damned if you don't, if the United States steps in. But by doing nothing, we've basically declared that we don't have an interest. And essentially, since we're still a world power, we're going to end up having to clean up many disasters, whether we want to or not. That's simply our role in the world, in world affairs right now. So we're going
now, to be fair, many Americans on the right and the left, you might call them the isolationist wings of both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and they exist in both parties,
right.
Say that's not our role to be the world's policeman. That I can hear Pat Buchanan on the right, or I can hear well, there are a number of people on the left,
right.
And then there's interventionists, liberal interventionists. Harry Truman comes to mind, conservative interventionists. So how do you make the argument that it's up to the United States to be the world's policeman? After all, Iraq, I think many Americans think, didn't go so well.
Well, I'm not saying that we have to be the world's policeman, but what I am saying is that we have a role that even Hillary Clinton, I believe, said before Congress, right before she left. Her Secretary of State position was that if the United States doesn't lead, there are consequences. I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. That is very true, but we're the one that the world turns to. So there are going to be consequences when we don't get involved. So this isn't, I mean, one can argue about whether we should or shouldn't, but that doesn't deal with the reality that we are, period.
Well,
we can say that we don't want to, but they're going to turn to us, and then we are going to have to do something. And there's not it's not like you can turn to Europe. Like Europe, look at France dealing with Mali. They can't actually take care of a military situation. They don't have strategic lift. They need the United States military, even in a background role. There simply isn't another country that can do what we do.
Didn't Europe lead the way in Libya, and we followed and got rid of the Gaddafi regime?
Incidentally, and that probably turned out to be a mistake because that happened at the exact same time that the protests started in Syria. And if the United States were taking a realistic look at who Americans' enemies are, you would look at Syria and say, well, they are a charter member of the State Department's list of terror-supporting states since '79. That's an actual enemy. It's in our interest to make sure that the Assad regime falls. That would have made sense. Gaddafi, a problem from the past. Not a current problem. We just haven't done a really good job of figuring out what our priorities are.
Maybe Libya is low-hanging fruit. It has less of an air defense. It's mostly a desert with just a few cities along the coast. It seems easier to knock off the Gaddafi regime than in Syria. And Syria would be middle-hanging fruit, with Iran being to really push this analogy too far, fruit at the top of the tree. I mean, an extremely difficult country.
Okay, that would make sense. So then it's puzzling, isn't it?
I mean, we're not going to attack China. China has invaded Tibet. The people of Tibet are ruthlessly repressed by China, and China is extremely powerful, and no one is suggesting freeing the people of Tibet, although I think we could all agree that we'd love to see Tibet be a free country. At some point, doesn't it become too difficult to intervene?
At some point, does it become too difficult to intervene? In Syria, yes, we've made it more difficult.
And Iran's even more difficult, isn't it?
Exactly.
So is that an argument then for containment rather than an attack?
Well, I'm not advocating an attack, but the idea that you can contain a nuclear-armed Iran it doesn't make sense.
Why we contain the Soviet Union? We're containing China. I don't know if we're containing North Korea or not. Frankly, I can't figure out what's going on there. How is Iran different from those cases?
The Soviet Union and the United States had a red line, literally like a telephone line, where if something was going to happen, they could call each other and speak. No such communication exists between Iran and the United States, or Iran and Israel, or Iran and any other country that might want to get a nuclear weapon to defend against a nuclear-armed Iran.
I guess the heart of my question is, how is Iran more dangerous or expansionist than, say, the Soviet Union or China, or for that matter, North Korea, which seems to be lunatic fringe right there?
Simply put, because mutually assured destruction, which worked with the Soviet Union, is not something that prevents Iran. It's an inducement. That's not for the regime, that form of Armageddon scenario is acceptable. So that's not for Russia.
It sounds like the heart of the disagreement then is between you and, say, Alex Vatanka, my first guest, is his belief that the regime would not be willing to have some kind of Armageddon because he says the regime wants to maintain the power that they've put in place for 30 or 40 years, and your belief that the Iranian regime might just push the button.
Okay. Here's an important distinction. If they're trying to get a nuclear weapon right now, Iran, as most people I would say believe, look at their actions without having a nuclear weapon. When they try to assassinate an ambassador in Washington, blocks from where we
the Saudi ambassador, they tried to kill him.
Right. So these are their actions without a nuclear weapon. Now, if they have a nuclear weapon so that they can do whatever they want, and then simply have that as defense, they don't actually need to use a nuclear weapon. They don't have to use it, but it would change their entire their structure, the way that they support terrorism, is that is something that would just be unchecked at all. So to have that former regime, again, nuclear weapons, how much does the United States care that France has a nuclear weapon?
We don't care at all.
Right. Okay. So the problem is which regime has a nuclear weapon. So a regime that is dedicated to everything that is dedicated to being against everything that we are for is something that we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon in.
Is the United States even capable of taking out Iran's nuclear weapon program? Many people say they have the know-how. It would only delay it a year or two. And then as a follow-up, if it's difficult for us, I assume it would be even more difficult for Israel.
If a military action had to be taken, it would be far better for the United States to do it. Their capabilities are unmatched in the world. But I think a lot of the problem in the argument that it would just stall the program for a year is, yes, but the same thing was said about Iraq when Israel went against the Osiris reactor in 81. It was thought that would only break the system and break their enrichment process for a nuclear program by a year. But that was enough.
And of course, Israel took out Syria's incipient nuclear program just 2 or 3 years ago.
2007. Exactly.
And of course, it'd be hard to imagine Syria, which is in the throes of an extremely violent revolution, if someone had access to nuclear power. So
exactly. So you never know exactly what if you do something militarily that's not extreme, that doesn't take out every single centrifuge. That would be a daunting task, but it can still affect the regime's decision-making as it affected Hussein's decision process in Iraq.
But if there is an attack, no doubt it will lead to not just worldwide condemnation as unprovoked, but also Iran has threatened to retaliate and to support even stronger missile strikes into Israel and attacks on American and Jewish targets all around the globe. Isn't this the beginning of an all-out war?
Iran, this is, if Iran's acting like this is their restrained selves, then that should bode scarily for the future, wouldn't you think?
Well, aren't they restraining themselves to some extent? They're not in all-out war,
right? But that's not in their interest right now. Their interest is to get a nuclear weapon and then show that they have that in their back pocket. Whether they wanted to use it or not, it would change the whole calculus of the region, and again start this nuclear arms race. So,
do you think if the United States does not take military action in the next year or two, that Israel will do so?
That's really tough to say, and obviously I'm not in the
You're not speaking for them. I understand that, and I'm not asking you to speak for them. I'm asking you just as an analyst what your thoughts are.
I would say that we could probably look forward to more scientists disappearing or exploding randomly.
Things like the Stuxnet virus.
Exactly. These type of things that would keep whatever red line that has yet to be defined, as I mentioned before, that would just keep that can going down the road.
So if you were president of the United States, what would you advocate? What specifically do you think President Obama should be doing now? Okay, he's made the mistakes he's made. We can't change what happened in 2009 or even the deal in 2010. What should the president and Congress be doing right now to help resolve the situation?
If the Iranian regime, and this seems to be the case, and I think most people agree, if their number one interest is to remain in power, then they need to feel that there is a threat to them, and currently we don't have one. So we can talk about sanctions, but unless they actually believe that we would do something militarily, whether we did so or not, unless they believe it, their calculus isn't going to change. The way that they make decisions is not going to change, and they will still think that getting a nuclear program is good.
Are you saying we can't threaten the regime in any significant way without military force? That no sanctions?
The threat of military force would include putting a carrier group back there. I mean, to begin with, we can't send mixed messaging. We can't have a Defense Department official going out like last year and saying that we really couldn't do anything militarily against Iran, and then having someone the next week say that we could do something against Iran. So it doesn't look like we actually could do anything. If the Iranian regime doesn't believe we can do anything, then why are they going to change their behavior?
So two questions come to mind. The first is, do you think that any non-military action could be enough to persuade the regime? Any kind of stronger or smarter sanctions, could they work, or do you think that's just a fool's errand?
I believe yes, but I also believe that having an aircraft carrier group near the Persian Gulf and to be talking the talk of, we're prepared to do anything and having that sound credible is a part of diplomacy.
What would be the smarter, stronger sanctions that you would advocate?
For sanctions right now, I think they are already working. I don't think that they're going to work in the time frame that we're looking for. If it's supposed to be a year, and yes, every year it's going to be another year, everyone says, every analyst, until Iran can get a nuclear weapon. I'm not sure if for sanctions we can first impose the sanctions that we already have, and we need to then hold other countries accountable that are breaking them, and we need to stop issuing passes to other countries to skirt the sanctions. And again, as I said before, I still don't think that that's going to be enough to change the decision-making process in Iran.
So you want the credible threat of military force in the region, but of course
it has to be credible.
Some say that if Iran sees a credible threat of military force, they'll even rush to enrich even faster.
Right, but from that argument perspective, then the United States can do nothing. Period. Like there's an argument then that, well, if that's the damned if we do, damned if we don't approach, which again, we have to select a policy and then enforce it. We have to look after our own interests.
I'll tell you, I didn't ever said there were easy answers. It's a lot easier to ask hard questions than to give easy answers. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Matt Brodsky, thank you so much for coming here on the Inside Scoop and sharing your opinion with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
All right, coming up, last but definitely not least, is Joe Costa. Now, he is a fellow with me at the Truman National Security Project. He actually helped design a simulation on what would happen if America went to war with Iran. And one of the things I like about the Truman National Security Project is they are progressive, but at the same time, they are realist. And I can't wait to hear Joe Costa's view on all of this. We'll be right back, and you can also take your calls at 202-889-9797 right after this.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Does your child have difficulty controlling their anger or a history of academic failure in school? Options Public Charter School offers a therapeutic learning environment with small classroom sizes and on-site counseling services to help students succeed. Options PCS is now enrolling grades 5 through 11 for the upcoming school year. For more information, call Options PCS today at 202-547-1028. Options Public Charter School. Exceptional education for exceptional students.
Hello world, it's your boy, Richard. Every night when I get home, I find myself quite thirsty. Thirsty for an adult beverage, and that is why I prefer a tall glass of organic wine from the Organic Wine Company. Founded in 1972, the Organic Wine Company is the nation's oldest importer of organically produced wines. They have a tremendous selection, red, white, sparkling, and dessert wines, and it's oh so tasty. It's easy and inexpensive to ship right to your door. For a limited time, you can get an even bigger savings by visiting ecowines.com and using the coupon code FowlerShow. Join the movement of good-tasting, earth-friendly wine drinkers, led by the fine folks at the Organic Wine Company. You can find them online at ecowines.com or give them a call, 1-888-ECOWINES.com, and don't forget to use that coupon code FowlerShow for your extra special discount.
I'm Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico. Last year, my state became the 12th state to allow medical use of marijuana by patients who are seriously ill. Some people were surprised that a Republican governor supports medical marijuana, but I'm hardly alone. Groups like the American College of Physicians, American Nurses Association, and American Public Health Association have all acknowledged the medical value of marijuana. New research about medical marijuana is coming out almost every day, showing remarkable potential in all sorts of serious conditions, including cancer, AIDS, and chronic pain. But some in government still want to put politics and ideology ahead of public health. To learn more about medical marijuana and what you can do to help, contact the Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or visit them on the web at mpp.org. Thanks.
You're listening to WPWC We Act Radio, 1480 AM, weactradio.com.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. This is Mark Levine. I am sitting here with Joe Costa. He is the chair of the Nuclear Experts Group at the Truman National Security Project, where he and I are both fellows. I've known Joe a couple years now, and I definitely value your wisdom on this point. Here's what I find interesting, and you're my cleanup, so you get to sort of help analyze what everyone said. My three guests had extremely different views on what we should do. The first guest felt the sanctions were working. The second guest felt the sanctions were not working. The third guest felt that we need to have a credible threat of military force around the corner to threaten to do things. What they don't disagree on is the nature of the regime. They don't disagree that it's a repressive regime, that the Iranian people would prefer to have representative democracy, that they don't have that they're jailing journalists and bloggers and so forth. So I find that interesting because I've been on Russian TV where I've actually heard apologists for the regime claiming it's a democracy. And there are certain I guess you might call it democratic elements in Iran. They do have elections. The elections may be fixed, but people do go out and vote. So before we get to the nuclear program, what we should do, I just want to know if you concur about just the repressive nature of the regime.
Sure. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to be batting cleanup. What I'd say is that it's important to recognize in Iranian society that it is actually there's extremely active civic participation in its entire history. In the last century, you had 3 revolutions in Iran, which was the most besides what occurred in Russia. So you actually have a very, very active civic society, and that is part of the culture. That's embedded in part of the people who even currently are running the current Iranian government. However, since the 79 revolution, I certainly would agree that what we've seen since then has been a decrease in civil liberties, a serious human rights concerns, and my feeling is that you have strong sentiments within the Iranian population, within the Iranian people, that react negatively to this. So Secretary Clinton came out last year, and 2 years ago, I think, and she described the Iranian regime as a thugocracy. What you have is
do you support that characterization?
I think it's a little bit strongly worded. I think you have a country where you have a very strong military bureaucracy and power that is basically calling a number of the shots.
Now, it's interesting you said military because that's not... In discussing the regime, most people talk about the theocracy, the group of clerics at the top and the various guardian councils and other people appointed by the supreme leader that control the elections and so forth. There hasn't been that much discussion about the military. You're the first to bring it up. What is the role of the military in Iran? How much power do they have? And would they have enough power that there could actually be a military coup and they could get rid of the theocracy and have a military dictatorship?
Well, I think any time that you're looking at a strong individual, let's say dictator even, in any of these countries, you have to look at where they get their base of support from. In the Ayatollah Khomeini is the supreme leader of Iran right now. He has a very, very strong base of support within the military. That's his primary support.
Well, who are they? Are they clerics? Are they Islamic? Who's in the military? I don't think they're imams with long robes.
Well, the Revolutionary Guard is the major military unit. These individuals tend to be a bit more conservative. They tend to look at national security issues from a very just as it occurs in other countries, we are going to protect our own. Ayatollah Khomeini, when he rose to power and since then has consolidated the military to be his number one supporters. The military also is a major economic power in Iran, owning a number of national and industrial assets. So,
is this a completely different military from the one the Shah had? I mean, just completely different people,
yes,
or all right,
yes,
none of them are the same.
This is completely different.
All right, okay.
And so, yes, Ayatollah Khomeini needs to have support among the clerics, and yes, that is important for him to stay in power. But if you're looking for where he derives his support, it's from the military. And what he's been able to do is he's been able to consolidate sort of a direct line between the military leaders and himself. And to your question of would there be a military coup, I would put that as an extremely low probability, because what the supreme leader has done is he basically has put the military in a position to reap economic gains from the country's massive energy and oil reserves, and he also pays them out. So one of the impacts of sanctions that we should always look at is that as Iran is being drained of actual resources, Khomeini has less money to then pay off the people who keep him in power. So
you just have to be careful with Iranian names, because Ayatollah Khomeini was the first one. This is Khamenei. It's all about the accent on the last syllable. And then there was President Khatami, and you really got to be very, very, very careful to. I know you mean Khamenei,
yes,
not Khomeini. But so when I look at Iran, in particularly developing nuclear weapons, I always think about North Korea, because when I worked in Congress, North Korea was in the process of developing a nuclear weapon, and I remember everyone saying, it's next year, it's next year, it's next year, and then it happened. Now, to be fair, North Korea is far more repressive than Iran. It's probably the most repressive regime in the world. But when you have a country who, just last week threatened to nuke the United States and end the Armistice Treaty of 1953, you can see where when a renegade country gets nuclear weapons, they may step up at least their tone, shall we say. Mm-hmm. What is the likelihood that a nuclear-armed Iran would go down towards the path of a nuclear-armed North Korea, say?
Well, they're two very different cases, and they're two fundamentally different governments. And so I would err caution when you try to make any sort of a direct comparison. What I think you would find, if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, sort of the canonical options that people have laid out, right? It will be a little bit more aggressive in the region. It possibly will increase its terrorist activities. It could be emboldened to certain actions it wouldn't necessarily before. Iran is has a much more of a rational foreign policy than North Korea. Its strategy is not necessarily to provoke, looking to get a reaction, which North Korea does. Iran is much more of a meticulous, methodical, plays the long game in terms of developing relationships across the region. So I think you see it has a bit more leverage when it's negotiating with some regional countries in terms of give and take on some issues that are important to Iran. I don't think that you would see as much of a direct provocative stance towards the United States as you see with North Korea today.
Is it your view that Iran is enriching nuclear material for the purpose of developing a bomb? I mean, that very simple question has gotten three very different responses from my guests, from people being absolutely sure they are to being absolutely sure that they're not, and this is sort of an option. Where do you come down on this?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of foolish to give an absolute answer in this sort of situation. I mean, if you're not, you try and take a step back and look at what, public statements, certain indicators, and facts from the International Atomic Energy Agency, and try to really put together.
What's your view?
What is their intent? I'll give it to you.
Okay. I like to put people on the spot here.
Yeah,
Joe,
no problem. So my view is that Iran has the strategic intent to put itself in a position to acquire nuclear weapons if it makes a decision to do so. What that means is I agree with our 16 national intelligence agencies, which Director of our National Intelligence, James Clapper, testified to Congress just last week saying that Iran could eventually produce a nuclear weapon, meaning they have not yet made a decision to do so. I think Iran is putting itself in a position, so it's a screwdriver turn away from acquiring a weapon if circumstances warrant that decision. So it's a
now
political
you say a
decision.
screwdriver turn away. Obviously, it's not just a screwdriver. One of the things that Jamal Abdi pointed out is they would have to not only enrich uranium to 95%, they'd have to pack it in a bomb, they'd have to develop the technology, if they haven't already, to miniaturize it and put it on warheads. Is all of that necessary? Is when you say screwdriver turn, that sounds like a minute.
Right.
Is it weeks, months, years? How long does that screwdriver take to turn?
Sure, and this is actually an important question because our president, for the first time, President Obama, this week said that he believes Iran is about a year or more away from a nuclear weapon, and a lot of people.
But didn't he say that 2 or 3 years ago?
A lot of people, not Obama.
Not
We've
Obama.
had other administration officials that said it. But what goes into that assessment is exactly what Jamal was referring to. First, if we're talking about overt facilities and not covert facilities, Iran would actually have to either repipe its current centrifuges to produce highly enriched uranium, or it could do something called batch recycling, which would require it putting its material that it has through and through and through centrifuges. That process takes a few months. Then the process of actually producing the HEU, let's say if they repipe 2-3 months, highly enriched uranium, that takes an additional, estimates have ranged from about 4 to 6 months. Then they would have to fashion this material into a cylindric ball that actually goes into the warhead and fuels the warhead, and that actually takes an additional few months. So when you
you began this whole process by saying if we talk about Iran's overt facilities,
so
why would we be talking about Iran's overt facilities?
I completely,
what about what's going on covertly? Isn't that the heart of the question?
I completely agree with you, which is why the International Atomic Energy Agency has met with Iran 12 times since January 9 times since January 2012, where they're looking for what they're calling a structured approach to addressing Iran's potential nuclear weapons related activities, precisely because the IAEA wants to get enough access where it can begin to look at possible covert activities.
Well, now Jamal Abdi said that the IAEA does do these inspections, that they even have a camera at the underground facility in Fordo. Yes, gotta get those names right. And his view is that basically Iran is being monitored. But I hear complaints from the IAEA all the time about obstruction. What is Iran being monitored?
Well, the answer is Iran's known and overt nuclear facilities are being monitored. It is the most inspected country in the history of the International Atomic Energy Agency. IAEA inspectors are on the ground every 2 weeks. There's a report that's put out every 3 months. So it's a very closely monitored program. The concern, though, as you said, and as I think most people believe, if Iran were to go for a weapon, it's going to be through their unknown or covert activities. So what the IAEA wants access to is interviews with Iranian scientists that were potentially involved in the history of the program. They want access to additional sites that we know exist, but Iran is not allowing access to because it's not directly related to their civil program. And through these sorts of measures, we can begin to get maybe some transparency in the full comprehensive scope of Iran's nuclear program. And I think that's necessary in order for Iran to be in compliance with its international obligations to be fully transparent about its nuclear activities, and that could help resolve the issue.
So do we have any way of knowing a screwdriver turn away? I mean, that obviously suggests a minute. Do we have any idea of knowing whether Jamal Abdi and even President Obama are right that it would take a year or more, or whether they're not covertly doing the process to be, if not a minute away, say 4 weeks away?
Our intelligence on Iran has been very good. If you're the supreme leader of Iran, you're looking at the fact that in 2002, your covert enrichment facility was discovered. And then in 2010, the Fordow covert enrichment facility was discovered. We have eyes in the sky, and we're watching them very, very closely with the sort of technologies that didn't exist during Iraq and Iraq.
In fact, Iran just chased a drone of ours over the Persian Gulf last week.
That's
so
exactly
they don't like our eyes in the sky. But, eyes in the sky can only see so much. I don't think they can penetrate a mountain.
A covert enrichment facility is very, very small, like the one in Qom. You can fit it into... It could even operate with a high-powered generator. So yes, it could be very, very, very very
How
difficult.
small? I mean, it wouldn't fit in the studio, presumably. But
no, I would say probably no one could see it, but I'd probably say about 2 times the size of your studio. And
that is very small. To be fair, that's no one has an apartment in New York that's as small as twice this studio. So that's a very small area.
Yeah, and with highly enriched uranium, it doesn't necessarily give off radiological indicators, so it's very difficult to detect.
So is the only way to know spies on the ground? I mean, is that...
Well, what we're looking for is if you have 24/7 surveillance by International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, which is an international team that can, yes, be sort of walking the ground. And there's no perfection. But the point that we want to get to, even with our current negotiations with Iran, is to increase the risk of Iran getting caught if it decides to actually produce a nuclear weapon.
What are the consequences of that risk? I mean, what if, Iran a year or two ago was talking about it wouldn't go past 5%, now it won't go past 20%. As my last guest pointed out, 20% enriched uranium is 70% of the process, because once you get to 20, it's a lot easier to get to more. What are the consequences? We've caught them, as you point out, in Fordo in 2002 and 2010. I guess the consequences would be the sanctions, right? Do those really inflict pain on the leaders rather than the people of Iran?
Right. So first of all, when you have 20% enriched uranium, you're 90% on the way to highly enriched uranium. So, and what that means is it cuts down the time that Iran could produce highly enriched uranium, and that's the concern of it producing this material.
And highly enriched uranium is what you put in a nuclear bomb.
And highly enriched uranium is what you put in a nuclear bomb.
Okay.
I think that we have seen risks increasing on the Iranian regime with each step that it has taken, right? So the current set of sanctions right now are the most comprehensive that have ever been put on Iran in the history of the country. I know people have probably spoke about the numbers in the show before, but a 50% decrease in oil exports, a 50% devaluation of the real.
That was 70% actually, devaluation of the real. But
okay.
Whatever.
So
it's heavy. It's
heavy.
hard.
It's enough.
But that hurts the people.
Yes.
Does it hurt the regime?
We are targeting individuals that we know are affiliated with its weapons-related programs. But yes,
when you say targeting individuals, let's get rid of the euphemism here. You're talking about killing scientists, basically.
No. I'm saying we've targeted in bilateral U.S. and EU sanctions. We are going after specific individuals that are involved with weapons-related programs. Can't travel. We're going after their bank accounts, etc. But yes, the leadership that has currently makes decisions on the nuclear program are living very comfortably right now, whereas the average Iranian is getting hit. And this is sort of
does that mean then that sanctions,
literature on sanctions that this is what happens.
I was going to say, doesn't that mean that sanctions are counterproductive? We're hitting the wrong people.
Well, we're certainly hitting some people where. Well, let me put it this way: the Iranian economy had negative GDP growth last year. The IMF recently put out forecasts. They expect 0.8% growth in the next year, and that's based on Iranian numbers, which most people think are actually false. Inflation is through the roof. Youth unemployment is a major problem, and Iran's major problem economically is not the sanctions. It's horrific mismanagement of their economy.
And the people are very angry about corruption. So at the end of the day,
angry about corruption.
Between the sanctions and the devaluation and the unemployment and the reduction in revenues, is what we're really doing trying to persuade the Iranian people to overthrow the regime?
No, I don't think that this. I don't think there's a strong belief among our decision makers that the Iranian regime is going to topple anytime soon.
So destroying the Iranian economy, other than inflicting pain on the ordinary person in Tehran, how does that affect the Supreme Leader Khamenei's decisions on anything?
Well, there's a few things that they're doing. The first is, which is very important, is that sanctions are slowing Iran's technical progress with this nuclear program.
Right, so that's a real effect.
It's not able to get certain equipment that it could have gotten before. So where we sit now might have been where Iran sat 2 years ago, technically, right? Second is we're giving ourselves a longer time for possibly diplomacy to work. It does delay the game a little bit because of the technical reasons I just described. The third is that, as I explained, the Supreme Leader depends on oil revenues in order to remain in power, and so do some of his friends. So as
he's got to pay off his military.
He's got to pay off his military. So as these revenues decrease, you naturally have people sort of popping up saying, "Hey, this whole sanctions thing doesn't seem to be going so hot for me. I have to pain for me to move all my bank accounts around. I'm actually losing a little bit of money. Maybe we should consider our approach right now. So if there's an active discussion in Iran right now, which I believe there is, in terms of how quickly to advance the nuclear program, whether you make the final decision to acquire a weapon, these are some real considerations that they have to...
Is diplomacy working at all, or are they just stringing us along? We'll talk to you next month. Well,
diplomacy hasn't delivered the results that we all would have hoped, but I think it has reaped a few benefits, right?
Such as what?
So before, if you look at when we sort of engaged in this issue, which is 2002, when the Natanz enrichment facility was revealed to the world, we had a period of time where it was just the European Union that was negotiating with the Iranians. By having U.S. direct engagement, one is we're actually getting direct feedback on their positions. We have a better understanding of what they want.
What do they want?
Well,
they say they don't want a nuclear weapon at all. They just want the right to have nuclear enrichment for peaceful purposes. That's what they say. What do they really want?
Well, I think if you're looking at it from the Supreme Leader's primary objective, it's to stay in power. So it's very interesting. After Gaddafi fell, the Supreme Leader in his Nowruz message came out, and he had a section that was on Libya and his nuclear lesson from Libya, which was Gaddafi gave up his weapons in return for said favors, and now look at where he sits. I think that's that
sounds like he's not stopping then.
Well, let me finish. And then if you look at what occurred with North Korea, right, our axis of evil, North Korea hasn't collapsed yet.
Right.
So I think the Supreme Leader's sitting there saying to himself, well, wait a minute. If you have the weapon, you don't fall. If you don't have the weapon, there could be a chance that the U.S. comes after you. So primary number one objective, I think, for Supreme Leader is to stay in power. And I think having a nuclear deterrent is a very attractive option to fulfill that objective.
So Matt Brodsky's answer is put forward a credible threat of force. Send a carrier group into the Persian Gulf. Make clear to Iran we mean business if you don't negotiate. What's your view on that?
We've been building a very credible case,
he doesn't think we have. He thinks we've shown vacillation and weakness.
So in the last year, we doubled our minesweepers from 4 to 8. We have a strong aircraft. Our aircraft carrier presence is at enhanced levels. Our land-based strategic strike aircraft, such as F-22s, have increased at multiple places across the GCC. If you look at arms sales to our Gulf allies,
the GCC.
The Gulf Cooperation Council.
Thank you.
The U.S. in the last year has significantly increased its military presence.
Should we send a fighter group up the Persian Gulf in very loud terms that everyone's going to follow?
I think this is sort of diplomacy 101. If you ever read any of Kissinger's great books or some of our great statesmen, diplomacy is the assembly of both the balance of incentives and costs, and I think that we have really been building a credible military option that has Iran sort of sitting back and thinking. Now, we're sort of along this path where you're going to see increased sanctions, increased sort of military options in the Gulf, and Iran's going to continue with its nuclear program, and we're going to reach some sort of a decision point. This will come to
Sounds
a
like
head.
A game of chicken to me, and I don't know who's going to swerve.
Well, my old boss called it a slow-moving Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think that's certainly on the trend line that we're facing. But when you get to that point, there's no reason to assume the worst case scenario that's when Iran's going to just go ahead and run to the bomb. It's much more complicated than
We only have about a minute left. You have to explain all of this in 1 minute, but
Okay.
Where does it end up? I mean, the answer is if it is a game of chicken, Iran swerves and backs down. I mean, can they do that for pride? Or are we going to have to go to military strike? Is it going to end up being some kind of dramatic? I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis was pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
Is there any hope for diplomacy absent that game of chicken here?
Yeah, I think that I do still think that there's room for diplomacy, and I do still think that we have time to address this issue. Because think about Iran faces some serious. If Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, think about the risks that it faces. It potentially engages in a multilateral arms race in the region at exorbitantly high costs. It potentially risks a strike by the U.S. or Israel, even if it were perceived to start to pursue this.
I got to wrap it up.
Okay.
You and I could talk for hours and hours on this.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Joe, thank you very much for coming here. I do appreciate this, and it's been a very interesting, complex discussion on all of my panelists. If you want to check out this show, it'll be on my website at marklevinetalk.com. It'll also be posted on YouTube, on my Facebook page, Mark Levine fan page. I'm going to post it on Twitter at Mark Levine Talk. You don't want to miss, if you missed any part of this show, all the wisdom of all of my four guests. I don't have any answers. I said that at the outset, but I do like to ask the hard questions because, heck, someone has to. This is Mark Levine of the Inside Scoop. Thank you so much for joining in.
Good.
All right.